The third month was when people started noticing, though not in the way Megan wanted to be noticed. 3 months into her rotation at Mercy General in San Diego meant she'd stopped being the new community college nurse and started being the one who triple-checked every floor placement, every angle, every depth of insertion. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm above the trauma bays, and she moved through them the way water moves through channels, efficient, purposeful, leaving no turbulence behind. It was a Tuesday morning when the older patient grabbed her wrist. She was inserting a central line into his basilic vein, the needle positioned at exactly 45 degrees, her hand steady as surgical steel, when his eyes widened and his grip tightened. Not painful. Just recognition. His voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible over the ventilator beside his bed. "You're the medic from the photos they showed us in training, aren't you?" Megan didn't pause. Didn't flinch. The needle went in. The sinus rhythm on the monitor stayed smooth. She taped the line down with the same measured precision she'd learned 8 years ago in a place she wasn't supposed to remember, and when she spoke, her voice was level as concrete. "Just a good for placement, sir. You need rest." She didn't look at his face. Didn't meet the eyes that had seen something in her that she'd spent 6 years burying inside the lining of a jacket that hung in her locker, wrapped around medals that no longer had a name attached to them. The jacket's unit patch was faded, the edges fraying where she'd sewn it herself with black thread during a 2 a.m. moment 3 weeks after the extraction went classified. Bronze Star with Valor was the smallest of them. Purple Heart came next. Joint Service Commendation Medal, the edges still sharp from the original box. The Silver Star lay underneath, its ribbon pressed flat against the cloth. And below all of them, wrapped in its own protective sleeve, was the photo. Ramadi, 2014. 14 members of her SEAL Team 3 unit standing in front of a compound that no longer existed, faces half hidden by scope shadows and the kind of exhaustion that only came from being alive after you weren't supposed to be. She kept that jacket in locker 247B, the metal cold under her fingertips every morning, and she told no one what was inside it. Megan had been working in hospitals long enough to understand the hierarchies that existed like invisible scaffolding beneath the fluorescent-lit corridors. The attendings stood at the top, the residents below them, deferential, hungry, trying to climb. The charge nurses held the actual power but pretended they didn't. The floor nurses moved in the spaces between, and community college nurses occupied a category so low it barely registered as human. She understood this the way she understood triage, assess, categorize, survive. The fact that she'd gotten the job at Mercy General at all had been a small miracle orchestrated by a VA hospital psychiatrist and a forged recommendation letter that she'd printed herself. Then came the day Dr. Hargrove noticed her. He arrived for rounds at 7:13 a.m., 5 minutes before the official start time, which meant he was making a point about punctuality that nobody needed him to make. 15 years. That was the number he dropped into conversation like a down payment on respect. 15 years as an attending at Mercy General, which meant he'd outlasted 2 hospital directors, 3 chief nurses, and 4 different electronic medical record systems. The young residents parted around him like water around a stone, their voices softening into something approximating deference. When he spoke, they listened. When he made decisions, administrators rubber-stamped them. It was the kind of institutional power that couldn't be challenged from below because nobody below had the leverage or the vocabulary to challenge it. He was reviewing a chart in the nurse's station when she walked past, and something in his peripheral vision caught. Not her face. Not her name tag. Something in the way she held the 4 kit, the specific angle of her wrist, the efficient spacing of her fingers, the exact rhythm of her movement. She was preparing a 14-gauge angiocath for a patient in bed 7, and every motion was economical, purposeful, the kind of precision that came from doing the same thing under pressure more times than a community college nurse should ever have experienced. Dr. Hargrove watched her hand disappear behind the privacy curtain, and for exactly 3 seconds, his jaw tightened. He didn't look up from his chart, but his eyes tracked her as she emerged from the bay and moved toward the supply closet. Megan felt the weight of his attention the way animals feel atmospheric pressure change before a storm. She kept moving, didn't acknowledge it, didn't adjust her pace. The smell of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, mixing with the fainter scent of fresh coffee from the break room, and she breathed it in through her nose the way she'd been trained to do, slow, measured, the pattern that kept her heart rate steady. The patient with the central line was 74, a retired Marine named Garrett, and when Megan checked on him an hour later, he was asleep, his breathing synchronized with the ventilator, the fall-line running clean and clear. But when he woke, his hand reached out and found her wrist again, and this time he whispered something different. "Thank you." Just that. Just the one word. She squeezed his hand once and didn't pull away, because that was the part of nursing that nobody told you about in community college. Sometimes holding on was the most important intervention of all. Dr. Hargrove's office was on the 3rd floor, corner suite with a window that overlooked the ambulance bay. He spent his lunch break there most days, and he was there now, reviewing the digital files of the nursing staff. Community college. That's what the annotation said next to Megan O'Brien's credentials. Not University of San Diego. Not UCSD. Not any program that produced nurses who understood the social contract of hospital hierarchy. And yet the chart notes were immaculate. The fall log showed 0 complications. 3 months and a perfect record, which was the kind of thing that made ambitious nurses dangerous, because perfect records attracted the attention of administrators, and administrators asked questions about promotions. He made a note in his personal file. Spelled her name 3 times to make sure he had it right. Pulled up her schedule and observed the pattern, always on Thursday evenings, always the trauma bays, always requesting the sickest patients available. That wasn't normal. That was either suicidal ambition or something else, and Hargrove had spent 15 years learning how to identify the difference. He didn't know which category Megan O'Brien fell into yet. But he would find out. The next Thursday, he arrived at 6:15 p.m., 45 minutes before the evening shift began, which meant he was making a point about ownership that only he understood. The nurse's station was already buzzing with the early shift hand-off, voices overlapping, the printer spitting out admission papers at the rhythm of an automatic weapon. He positioned himself behind the counter, clipboard in hand, and waited. He didn't have to wait long. Megan came through the sliding doors at 6:28 p.m., her scrubs navy blue, her badge clipped to her collar, her jacket, that faded green jacket that had no business being worn in a San Diego summer, folded over her arm. Her eye scanned the department the way a sniper scans a roofline, taking in exit positions, identifying the critical nodes, assessing pressure and flow. "Ms. O'Brien." He used the voice that had broken hospital residents into compliance, the one that suggested you'd made an error in judgment and he was the only thing standing between you and consequences. A word. She turned. Her expression didn't change. No smile. No nervousness. Just a straight horizontal line where her mouth should have been, an ice the color of slate after rain. "Of course, Doctor. I've been reviewing your charting," he said, keeping his voice low enough that the other nurses would have to strain to hear, which meant they would definitely strain to hear. "The precision is remarkable for someone at your experience level." "Thank you, sir. I didn't give it as a compliment." He tapped the clipboard against his palm, a slow, deliberate rhythm. "In my experience, when nurses start showing that kind of technical competence this early, they're either documenting someone else's work or they're taking shortcuts." "Which is it?" The moment stretched. Someone's monitor beeped 3 times and fell silent. A stretcher rolled past with the wheels squeaking against the tile, that rubber-on-linoleum friction that filled every hospital in America at 6:08 p.m. Megan's hand tightened on the jacket she was holding, but her voice remained unchanged, pitched in that register that suggested she was answering a routine question about patient vitals. "I verify every procedure independently, Doctor. No shortcuts. See that you don't." He turned back to his charts, which was the move designed to make her feel dismissed, the way dismissal was a tool he'd learned to weaponize. "Community college programs have standards, Ms. O'Brien. We maintain higher ones here. I hope you can keep up with that adjustment." She didn't respond. She moved toward locker 247B, hung the faded green jacket on the hook, and disappeared into the supply closet to begin her shift. But Hargrove watched the jacket for exactly 5 seconds, his eyes narrowing at something in the way the fabric hung, the weight of it, the density of something hidden inside the lining. He didn't know what it was. Not yet. But he knew something was there. He made his opening move during shift change in the nurses' station at 3:15 p.m. on a Thursday, when the department was crowded enough to matter. Dr. Hargrove leaned against the medication dispensary with the casual confidence of someone who'd owned the space for 15 years, waiting until 6 nurses and 3 residents had gathered around the assignment board. Megan was charting at the far station, visible but not part of the circle. He let the silence build. "I'm giving it 1 week before O'Brien here washes out," Hargrove announced, his voice pitched to carry without shouting. "Community college nurses always do. Anyone want to take that bet?" The room shifted. A few laughs, the nervous kind that come when someone in power makes a statement that might be a joke or might be a threat. One of the senior nurses, Patricia, didn't laugh. Neither did Megan. She took one measured breath, let the silence hang like humidity before a storm, then returned to her charting without a word. That was the first thing Hargrove didn't understand about her. A normal person would have defended themselves. Would have said something. Would have flushed, eyes watering, the whole damaged reaction he'd spent 15 years learning to trigger. Megan simply turned a page. The psychological architecture he'd built, the dominance displays, the public humiliation, the casual cruelty masked as professionalism, suddenly felt like it was being tested against something he couldn't see. 2 days later, the cafeteria was packed. Lunch rush on a Saturday meant 200 staff rotating through in 90 minutes, the noise level like a helicopter hangar, conversations overlapping until individual voices disappeared into white noise. Megan sat alone at a corner table, a turkey sandwich in front of her, eating with the focused efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago not to waste time on meals. Dr. Hargrove walked past her table with practiced casualness and deliberately knocked her tray to the floor. The sandwich tumbled. The coffee mug shattered against the tile, sending dark liquid spreading like an accident scene. "Oh, sorry, didn't see you there," he said, loud enough for surrounding tables to hear. A few people looked over. Most didn't. Most already understood the hierarchy. Megan stood, looked at the mess pooling across the tile, looked at him, and said nothing. She walked to the supply closet, retrieved a mop and bucket, and cleaned it up herself while conversations died around her and the smell of coffee mixed with antiseptic bleach. Hargrove watched from across the cafeteria, waiting for the crack. He'd thrown the tray to create a moment of visible frustration, a response he could weaponize later. She gave him nothing. Just methodical movements, the efficiency of someone who'd cleaned up far worse than coffee. That afternoon, the hallway outside radiology was a river of traffic, patients wheeling toward imaging, visitors carrying balloons, residents moving between departments, the constant flow of a hospital functioning at capacity. Megan stood at the counter reviewing a patient chart when Hargrove appeared beside her with a folder in his hand. He threw it at her feet, paper scattering across the tile like autumn leaves. "Pick that up, sweetheart. Your handwriting's illegible. This is why we don't let community college grads skip steps." His voice carried the specific texture of contempt that comes from absolute certainty of authority. 2 patients waiting in the hallway turned to look. A visitor with a camera around her neck paused mid-step. The moment crystallized, the public acknowledgement that hierarchy existed and Megan O'Brien was at the bottom of it. She bent down and began gathering every sheet with methodical precision, organizing them by number, checking that none were torn, stacking them in order. The work took 37 seconds. When she stood and locked eyes with him, 1 tear had escaped down her left cheek. She didn't wipe it away immediately. She let him see it first. Then she wiped it with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact. "I've picked up pieces of people in Ramadi," she said, her voice steady as stone, each word pronounced with the clarity of someone who'd spent years practicing controlled delivery under catastrophic pressure. "Your tantrums don't impress me." The hallway went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their 60-cycle electrical drone. Hargrove's smile froze, just for an instant, a microsecond where his face betrayed that something fundamental had shifted. Then he recovered, turning to a nearby resident with practiced ease. document that insubordination. Make a note. But his hands had clenched at his sides. His jaw was working. He turned and walked away, not back to his office but toward the stairwell, moving with the abrupt speed of someone who needed distance and time to recalibrate. What happened in the next 12 minutes would change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. Megan returned the chart folder to the counter, and a man's voice came from the direction of room for 12, the same elderly Marine who'd spoken with her weeks earlier, during her first week at Mercy General. "Nurse O'Brien? Could you come here a moment?" She recognized the tone immediately. Not pain. Not distress. Recognition. The door was closed when she entered, and the patient was sitting up in bed, his phone in both hands, a training manual open on the screen. He was 73 years old, retired from 28 years of active duty, and his eyes had the specific weight that came from knowing things the world wasn't supposed to know. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking, the way someone studies a photograph to confirm it matches the original. "You're the medic from the photos they showed us," he whispered finally. "The classified briefing. The one who did the extraction at SIDC. The files they sealed." His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, not from weakness but from the specific emotion of sudden recognition, of seeing a legend walk past you for 3 weeks and not knowing. "Your senior chief O'Brien." Megan's face went white. Her breath caught, the first visible sign of fear she'd allowed anyone to see in 3 days. "That name doesn't exist anymore," she said quietly, the words barely audible. She turned and left the room before he could respond, closing the door behind her with the careful precision of someone trying not to let anything break. In her locker later, during her final 15 minutes of shift, she found her hands shaking for the first time, not from the confrontation with Hargrove, not from the humiliation, but from the fact that the past had a physical location now. It was in a hospital room on the 4th floor, in the memory of an old Marine, and there was no way to contain it. Dr. Hargrove stood in his office with the lights dimmed, staring out the window at the parking lot 6 stories below. The standard plays weren't working. Intimidation was supposed to break people. Public humiliation was supposed to shatter confidence. He'd refined these tactics over 15 years, tested them on residents and nurses and staff who couldn't fight back because the institutional power belonged entirely to him. But Megan O'Brien had absorbed both hits with a kind of composure that suggested she'd been hit far harder by far worse, and the slight crack in her voice when she mentioned Ramadi had only revealed more questions. He picked up his office phone and dialed the administrator, Marcus Chen, the man who owed him favors from a misdiagnosis incident 3 years prior. "Marcus, I need to discuss a personnel matter. New nurse on my team, community college background, some serious judgment issues. I want a formal file started." The voice on the other end confirmed, no hesitation. Second call was to a board member, David Sterling, who'd invested $300,000 in Hargrove's private practice, the one that paid him $70,000 a month in consulting fees. "David, I need to move forward with something we discussed. Some documentation concerns about a staff member. I'm going to need you to activate that investigator we talked about." The board member agreed. Hargrove had already won 15 years of structural battles. One nurse, even one nurse with something hidden, wasn't a threat to the carefully constructed network he'd built. Not yet. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was happening in the emergency department at 2:51 p.m. on the following Tuesday, when all the strategy in the world would become irrelevant, when the difference between institutional power and operational competence would matter more than anything else, and when Hargrove would finally understand that he'd been measuring the wrong threat the entire time. The doors hit the frame hard enough to crack the safety glass. 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. The man who came through was 7 feet of muscle and military bearing, but something had broken inside him. His eyes had that specific quality of terror, the 1,000-yard stare of someone already dead, just waiting for the body to catch up. His name was Marcus Webb. Former Army Ranger, 18 years of service, 2 tours through Fallujah, 1 through Sanjin Valley. He was screaming incoherently, not words but the raw animal sound of a man trapped in a firefight that had ended 14 years ago but never actually left his nervous system. The tire iron was in his right hand. He swung it at the reception desk, and the sound of it connecting was like a rifle shot, chrome and glass and terror all at once. The nurses scattered. They didn't run with purpose or professionalism. They ran like prey. The charge nurse vaulted over the medication cart. 2 residents pressed themselves behind the trauma bay curtains. The security guard, a man named Rodriguez who'd seen action himself in the Texas National Guard, drew his radio and stepped backward, his hands raised in what he probably thought was a calming gesture but which looked to anyone with real combat experience like the posture of someone who'd already given up. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway of his office, assessed the situation in half a second, and retreated behind the heavy metal medication dispensary, his phone already in his hand like it was a shield. Megan was at the suture station when she heard the glass crack. She didn't hesitate. She didn't call for backup or wait for someone else to handle it. She simply stood, set down the sterile field she'd been prepping, and walked directly toward the man with the tire iron. Her hands were visible. Empty. Her face was composed in that particular way that comes from having stood in the same position under enemy fire, where panic and action are the same thing and the only way through is to look calm enough that your presence becomes its own kind of weapon. She recognized what she was seeing in Marcus Webb's eyes before she recognized his face. That wasn't rage. That was a man whose sympathetic nervous system had hijacked everything else, whose amygdala was running the show, whose body was convinced that if he didn't kill everything in this room in the next 60 seconds he would be dead. The anterior cingulate cortex, the part that processes context and reality, was completely offline. He wasn't seeing the emergency department of Mercy General in San Diego on a Tuesday afternoon. He was seeing a street corner in Fallujah with IEDs strapped to dead civilians and insurgents in the windows and his buddy Martinez bleeding out 3 meters away. 90 seconds. That's what Megan had. Less actually, because Marcus's respiratory rate was already climbing past 30 breaths per minute and his pupils were dilated to the size of dimes and his jugular veins were starting to distend from the pressure building in his chest cavity. She could see it happening in real time, the cascade of stress hormones flooding his system, cortisol and adrenaline and norepinephrine spiking to levels that would make a trained athlete's heart rate look like resting pulse. Marcus. She said his name like it was a statement of fact, not a question. Not a plea. Just a name, steady as stone. Marcus Webb. 18th Airborne Corps, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse Company. I know that unit. I know that place. His head turned toward her. The tire iron didn't lower, but the arc of his swing slowed. Something in her voice had cut through the noise. You're not in Fallujah, Megan continued, each word measured and precise. You're in San Diego. It's 2024. You're safe. The firefight ended. You survived. They didn't. Marcus's voice was raw, broken. Martinez didn't. I know. Megan took 3 more steps. Hand still visible. Body language of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to fear. I know about Martinez. I know about Jolin District. I know the weight of that. But you're not there anymore. You're here. You're breathing. You survived. The tire iron dropped 6 inches. His breathing was still too fast, still too shallow, but the oxygen wasn't reaching his lungs anymore, the tension was building too fast. Megan could see the physical signs cascading in sequence, the way his right shoulder was rising higher than his left, the slight cyanosis around his lips, the way his neck veins were distending like cables under his skin. I need you to sit down, Megan said. Right here. Now. For a moment he obeyed. The tire iron clattered to the linoleum. Marcus's knees buckled and he went down hard on the tile floor, and that's when the pressure in his chest finally won. His breathing became rapid, shallow gasps. The right side of his chest was barely moving. Decreased breath sounds on the right. His skin was going gray. The panic attack had triggered the worst possible physiological cascade, tension pneumothorax, his lung crushed by building pressure in the pleural space, his mediastinum shifting, his heart being compressed by the force of his own catastrophic anxiety. Megan was already on her knees beside him, her fingers checking for tracheal deviation. She found it, shifted to the left, textbook presentation. His neck veins were distended like rope. His blood pressure was dropping, she could see it in the way his lips were losing color. I need a 14-gauge needle, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, now, she shouted toward the nurse's station, and her voice cut through the chaos like a command cadence. Not a request. Not a plea. An order. No one moved. They were still pressed against walls, still hidden behind desks, still operating under the assumption that this man was a criminal, a threat, something to be contained rather than something to be saved. Dr. Hargrove stepped forward from behind the medication dispensary, his voice sharp and institutional and utterly wrong for the moment. O'Brien, step back. Wait for the trauma team. Megan didn't even look at him. He'll be dead in 3 minutes. She was already palpating the anatomical landmarks with a precision that spoke of doing this under fire, under rain, under conditions where hesitation meant bodies in body bags. She located the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone for whom this procedure had become as automatic as breathing. A younger nurse, Sarah Chen, who'd only been at Mercy General for 8 months, broke from her frozen position and ran to the crash cart, returning with the decompression kit. Megan took it without thanking her, because gratitude could wait and breathing couldn't. She prepped the site with one hand while maintaining contact with Marcus's chest with the other. The antiseptic smell was sharp, chemical, real. The real was important right now. The real would bring him back. The catheter went in at a 90-degree angle, smooth and certain, and then there was the sound, the hiss of air escaping like a pressure valve opening. Escaping. Releasing. The sound of pressure dropping fast enough that a man's heart could beat again without being crushed by his own biology. Marcus's breathing eased within seconds. The color came back into his lips. The trachea shifted back toward midline. His oxygen saturation climbed from 68 to 78 to 85, visible on the monitor that Sarah had rushed over in the interim. His heart rate was still elevated but no longer in the red zone of imminent cardiac arrest. Dr. Hargrove's face went through a visible transformation, pale to flush to that particular shade of red that only came when authority was being challenged and there was nothing institutional about it. That is an unauthorized advanced procedure outside your scope of practice, O'Brien. You just ended your career. Megan looked up at him while maintaining pressure on the catheter, her hand steady, her voice level. I just saved his life. You violated hospital protocol. Security, escort her to her locker after the paramedics arrive. The trauma team rushed through the doors exactly 2 minutes later, and they took over Marcus's care seamlessly, but before they did, one of them, a trauma surgeon with 30 years of experience, paused and looked at the field decompression, and the needle placement, and the way the patient was already stabilizing, and he looked at Megan and said quietly, this was textbook. Battlefield textbook. Thank you. Megan stood. Her hands were finally beginning to shake, not from fear but from the come-down of adrenaline, the way bodies did after they'd done the impossible thing and survived it. She watched as Dr. Hargrove pulled out his phone and made 3 calls in rapid succession, his voice low and urgent, calling in favors, activating networks, doing what institutional power did when it felt threatened. He was calling the hospital administrator. He was calling someone at the board. He was calling someone else whose voice on the other end made him straighten his spine even though he was alone in his office. Sarah Chen was staring at Megan with an expression that looked like recognition and confusion mixed together. The charge nurse had emerged from behind the medication cart and was looking at the spot where Marcus had been lying, at the needle decompression kit, at the way a nurse who'd been at Mercy General for less than 4 months had just performed a procedure that most residents wouldn't attempt without a cardiologist present. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Hargrove had already made his decision. He'd already decided that a nurse who could do what Megan had just done was not an asset to his carefully constructed hierarchy. He'd already decided that she was a liability that needed to be eliminated. And he had the institutional power to do it. Dr. Hargrove had already decided that she was a liability that needed to be eliminated. And he had the institutional power to do it. By Friday morning, 48 hours after Marcus Webb walked out of Mercy General alive, Hargrove had activated his entire network. The phone call started at 6 in the morning. First call, Chief Operating Officer Patricia Mendez. Hargrove's voice was smooth, practiced, a reminder wrapped in concern. Patricia, I wanted to discuss the O'Brien situation before the board hears about the liability exposure. You remember that misdiagnosis on the councilman's daughter back in 2022? The one I documented as a medication interaction instead of a diagnostic miss. Silence on the line. He could hear her breathing change. I think we should talk about protocol violations and scope creep. For both our sakes. By noon, he had called 2 board members who'd invested in his private practice, Dr. Sterling's Cardiac Center, a high-end boutique operation in La Jolla. He didn't threaten. He simply reminded them that his center was underperforming this quarter and might need to redirect investment elsewhere. One of them, Board Chair Thomas Bennett, called back within an hour. What do you need, David? Hargrove smiled. Institutional leverage was a quiet thing, like pressure building behind a dam. It didn't announce itself. It simply crushed whatever stood in front of it. By Monday afternoon, an investigator from Mendez and Associates Medical Review, a firm that had a reputation for reaching predetermined conclusions if the retainer was large enough, arrived at Mercy General with a briefcase and a predatory smile. Her name was Dr. Ellen Soto, and she'd been hired to examine every charting decision Megan had made in her 3 months of employment. Every medication administration. Every procedure note. Every moment of independent decision-making. Soto spent 16 hours reviewing Megan's documentation, cross-referencing it with hospital protocols that had been designed by committees in 1997 and updated twice in the intervening decades. She found 6 instances of what she classified as documentation inconsistencies. Places where Megan's medical shorthand, the abbreviated style of someone trained to document battlefield triage in seconds while taking fire, didn't match the hospital's verbose templates. PT unstable 2.5 cubic centimeters fluid rhesus instead of patient presented with hypovolemic shock. Administration of 2,500 milliliters isotonic crystalloid via peripheral access commenced. She found no errors. She found no adverse outcomes. She found no patient harm. But inconsistency was enough. Hargrove's 40-page report was a masterpiece of institutional language. Pattern of independent decision-making without appropriate consultation. Documented tendency toward autonomous action outside established hierarchy. Concerning lack of deference to senior medical staff. He presented it to the board on Thursday morning, his voice steady as a surgeon's hand, his expression grave as a pallbearer. He showed charts. He showed metrics. He showed 6 instances of documentation that didn't match templates. He did not show the patient outcomes, because every patient Megan had touched had survived. He did not show Marcus Webb's chest X-ray, the lung fully re-expanded, oxygen saturation climbing to 96%. He showed only inconsistency. Only deviation. Only a challenge to his authority. On Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock, Megan was called to the administrator's office. The elevator doors hissed open on the 4th floor. Hargrove's office was at the end of the corridor, pale blue walls, expensive lithographs of sailboats, the kind of space designed to make decisions feel inevitable and civilized. COO Patricia Mendez sat behind the desk, her hands folded in front of her. Security Officer Thompson, a 62-year-old veteran with 16 years at Mercy General, a Marine who'd served 2 tours in Fallujah, stood by the door. His jaw was tight. He didn't want to be here. His eyes met Megan's for a single second, and in that second was an apology. Ms. O'Brien, Mendez said, reading from a prepared statement, her voice steady but her eyes unable to hold contact. Your employment is terminated effective immediately for performing procedures outside your scope of practice as a registered nurse. Unauthorized advanced procedures. Failure to follow established consultation protocols. You will be escorted to retrieve your personal belongings. Megan took one measured breath. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet as a monitor set to low volume. Marcus Webb is alive because of that procedure. His pneumothorax would have killed him in 90 seconds without needle decompression. That's not the point, Dr. Hargrove said from his position by the window. He'd been waiting for her, positioned so he could watch this moment like a conductor leading the final note of a symphony. His smile was thin, satisfied, the expression of a man who had just successfully removed a threat to his hierarchy. The point is institutional authority. The point is following proper channels. Consulting senior staff. Respecting the decision-making structure that keeps this hospital functioning. Thompson escorted her to her locker in the nurse break room on the second floor. His shoulders were hunched, his movements careful, the way someone walks when they're carrying something fragile. The locker was small, metal, industrial grey. Megan removed the jacket with a faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the colors muted from 22 years of wear, the patch showing the insignia of her unit, 3 small letters that meant everything to people who knew what they meant and nothing to people who didn't. She removed a photograph of Kyle, 17 years old, skateboard under one arm, bright smile, the kind of moment you capture and keep because you know how quickly everything changes. She removed a small wooden box from the back, wrapped in a towel, and placed all 3 items in a single paper bag. "I'm sorry," Thompson said, and he meant it in the way only another veteran could mean it. "I know what you did. I was there when Webb came in. I saw what you did. Take care of yourself, Thompson," she said. Her voice was level, the voice of someone who had already moved on to the next tactical problem, already calculating next steps the way a chess player sees 3 moves ahead. Hargrove watched from his office window as Thompson walked her to the front entrance of Mercy General. The late afternoon light was turning the glass doors golden. Hargrove pressed his palm against the glass, not quite touching it, the way a predator might press its face close to an aquarium, satisfied that the trapped thing inside had finally given up. His expression was a catalogue of victory, the slight curve of his mouth, the way his shoulders had relaxed, the pure satisfaction of institutional power successfully applied. Megan walked to her car in the parking lot, the paper bag under one arm. She didn't look back. That evening, at 6:53 p.m., Megan was sitting in the waiting room of the San Diego VA hospital in downtown, 10 miles from Mercy General. The waiting room was crowded, the walls are institutional beige that seemed to absorb hope. Fluorescent panels hummed overhead, a sound like electricity being slowly tortured. She was surrounded by veterans, a woman with a prosthetic leg, an older man staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else, 3 young Marines in civilian clothes with the particular posture of people who'd learned to sit without making themselves comfortable. Some of them nodded at Megan. Recognition, but quiet. These were people who'd seen enough to understand when someone else had seen things too. She held an intake form in her hands. Name, rank, service dates, reason for visit. The pen felt heavy, the way things feel when they're about to change everything. She wrote, Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien. The rank she hadn't written in 6 years. The name the government had told her never to use again, scrubbed from records, classified, filed under a redaction that covered a redaction. Service dates, 2002 to 2024. 22 years. 3 tours in Ramadi. A mission in 2018 that was still classified, the kind of classified where people didn't ask questions and you didn't answer them. Reason for visit, service-related trauma. Hypervigilance. Sleep disturbance. Difficulty readjusting to civilian environment. A veteran's nurse called her back for vitals. Blood pressure 118/76. Heart rate 64. Steady hands. The nurse, a woman in her 50s with grey at her temples and the same specific quality of attention that comes from years of trauma work, looked at Megan's chart and then at Megan's face and didn't ask any questions beyond the medical ones. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that at 8:34 p.m., as Megan sat in a patient waiting room at a VA hospital instead of walking a hospital floor she'd memorized in 3 months, Dr. Hargrove was sitting in his office at Mercy General, drinking a $12 craft bourbon, sending a text message to Board Chair Bennett, liability successfully terminated. Institutional authority maintained. Protocol preserved. And he believed completely that this was the end of the story. That institutional power, once applied, was absolute. That authority, once asserted, could never be challenged. He had no idea what was walking toward his office. He had no idea that Kyle O'Brien was at that very moment sitting in his mother's apartment, staring at the shadow box that had been sitting in their garage for 6 years, making a decision. He had no idea that a retired Marine pilot named Commander James Reeves, a man who'd known Megan when she was still senior chief, a man who owed her his life in more ways than one, was going to answer a phone call in approximately 8 hours and hear a teenager's voice say, "My mother needs help." He had no idea that the government doesn't scrub records for ordinary people. The government scrubs records for people who know too much, have done too much, and need to disappear because the world isn't ready to know what they've really accomplished. He'd won. He believed he'd won completely. And in exactly 24 hours, everything he'd ever built was going to begin to fall apart. Monday morning. 7:52 a.m. Megan was clearing out her locker when Kyle burst through the hospital's front entrance carrying something wrapped in cloth, his voice cracking before he even reached the administrative wing. "Mom, they need to see these. They need to see what you actually are." The words echoed down the corridor with the desperation of a 17-year-old who'd finally understood why his mother had spent 6 years telling him to never speak her name aloud in public. She turned. One slow movement. The locker door swung open on its hinges, and every nurse at the station went quiet. Kyle's face was streaked, not with tears, but with the intensity of someone carrying a burden that had suddenly become too heavy to hide. He walked past Megan without stopping, straight toward Dr. Hargrove's office on the 3rd floor. Megan followed. She didn't run. She didn't hurry. She moved with the same steady precision she'd used to approach Marcus Webb with a tire iron in his hands. Kyle pushed through the office door. Hargrove was at his desk, reviewing what looked like budget spreadsheets, the kind of administrative work that consumed his afternoons now that he'd successfully purged the emergency department of its most dangerous variable. He didn't look up immediately. "This is a private office, kid. You need to." Kyle slammed the shadow box onto the mahogany desktop with a crack that made the desk phone rattle. The sound was deliberate. Final. The kind of impact that announces something irreversible is about to happen. "My mom is Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien." Kyle's voice wasn't loud. It was steadier than it had any right to be. "And you just fired a legend." The lid came open. Inside, wrapped in a faded Navy unit patch, the kind that gets sewn into jacket linings where nobody sees it, were 7 medals. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. Purple Heart again. Joint Service Commendation Medal. And 3 others, each one catching the office light in a way that made them look less like brass and more like evidence. Hargrove's face did something complicated. The color drained from it like water from a basin with the plug pulled. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. You can't, this is classified information. You're interfering with nothing." Kyle's voice had taken on a quality that made every nurse in the hallway freeze. "You're interfering with nothing. My mother is standing right there, and you fired her anyway." Megan stepped into the doorway. She didn't move to the medals. She didn't look at them. She looked at Dr. Hargrove the way someone looks at a problem that's already been solved. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The only thing that changed was her eyes. They shifted from the careful neutrality of a nurse to something older. Something that had seen things that casual administrators in San Diego never would. The charge nurse, Linda Martinez, appeared in the doorway behind her with trembling hands. Then Sarah Chen. Then the attending physician from the day shift. By the time the Navy SEAL team leader appeared in the office doorway, the one who'd been visiting a patient on the orthopedic ward, there were 17 people in the administrative office, all of them staring at the medals. The SEAL team leader was tall. Built like someone who'd spent 20 years lifting and running and doing things that casual people never discussed. His name tape read Graves. He stepped forward and looked at the medals without touching them, reading each one aloud like a liturgy. Bronze Star with Valor. His voice was quiet, but it carried. Combat Leadership Under Fire. Fallujah, 2008. Hargrove gripped the edge of his desk. His knuckles went white. Purple Heart. Graves continued. First Wound. IED in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. Continued combat operations despite injury. Sarah Chen's hand went to her mouth. Purple Heart. Second Wound. Graves paused. His jaw tightened. Coordinated medical evacuation of 3 team members under sustained fire. Return to duty within 6 weeks. This is impossible, Hargrove whispered. Her records were, she's just a nurse. She came from community college. She doesn't have clearance for any of this. Joint Service Commendation Medal for extraordinary heroism in the line of duty. Graves's voice didn't waver. 12 lives saved during a surgical strike operation that was never officially declassified. And the last one here, he picked up the final medal. It was heavier than the others. Golden enamel, the weight of something that came with the ceremony. Navy Cross. Rescue of a high-value asset under conditions that violated conventional tactical doctrine. 3 engagements. 0 casualties. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum above, a sound like electricity remembering itself. Graves turned to face Hargrove directly. I trained with Senior Chief O'Brien. This woman extracted a government asset from a compound that intelligence rated as 70% casualty probability. She brought everyone home. Every single one. An FBI agent arrived 90 minutes later. Not the local field office, this was someone with the kind of quiet authority that came from Washington. Agent Patricia Cross. She carried a folder that had been sealed so many times there were creases on the creases. Her first words to Hargrove were delivered in a tone that suggested she'd said them before to better men who'd made worse mistakes. Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien was placed in protective status following the extraction of a high-value target in 2009. Her identity was classified. Her service record was classified. Every photograph, every communication, every recommendation for Valor was locked behind clearance levels that you don't possess, Dr. Hargrove. Those medals your son displayed represent operations that don't officially exist. Hargrove tried to speak. His voice came out thin. I didn't know. She was questioning my authority. She's a threat to protocol. What you are, Agent Cross said, is a criminal. She pulled something else from the folder. Security footage. Time-stamped. The cafeteria. Hargrove's hand connecting with Megan's tray. His voice calling her sweetheart with contempt sharp enough to draw blood. The hallway. His arm extending. The chart hitting the floor near her boots. You attempted to delete this footage at 11:47 p.m. on Friday night. Marcus Petty, the IT director, has it backed up in 4 separate locations. He's a Marine Corps veteran. He understood what he was protecting. Hargrove's face cycled through about 6 different shades of grey. We also have phone records, Agent Cross continued, her tone never changing. Conversations where you leveraged a covered-up medical error by your hospital administrator. Pressure applied to board members regarding financial interests in your private practice. Communications with a medical review firm owned by your brother-in-law. This is fraud, harassment, witness intimidation, and attempted obstruction of justice. I want my lawyer, Hargrove said. You'll get him, Cross replied. But before he arrives, understand that Marcus Webb, the soldier your colleague wanted to let die, is giving interviews to veteran advocacy groups. The story of a nurse who saved his life while the attending physician tried to restrict her care is in 7 news outlets already. Your license suspension is effective immediately. Your contract is void. Everything you built is being dismantled by people who take this more seriously than you do. She closed the folder. It made a sound like a door closing on a previous life. "Megan," she said, turning to face her directly. "Your status is officially restored. Full recognition, protected status maintained, pension reinstated with back pay. The Navy Department has offered you a position as Deputy Director of Advanced Combat Medicine at Walter Reed. There's also a civilian offer on the table from Mercy General. They want you to build their emergency medicine division from the ground up." Megan looked at Kyle. Her son was standing there with his arms crossed, the way soldiers stand when they're trying not to show emotion. "How long have you known?" she asked him. "About 8 months," Kyle said. "Grandma told me everything. She said it was time I understood why you came home different that one time. Why you flinch at fireworks. Why you check the exits in restaurants." Megan reached over and squeezed his shoulder. Not for comfort. For acknowledgement. For the fact that he'd understood what needed to happen before she did. 6 months later, Mercy General's emergency department looked different. The walls were the same pale institutional grey, but the protocols had changed. The triage system was redesigned around combat medicine principles. The psychological assessment procedures included screens for trauma-based mental health crises. The staff roster included 3 new trauma specialists and a dedicated psychiatric liaison trained to recognize and respond to veteran presentation of PTSD. Megan stood in the hallway where Dr. Hargrove had thrown the chart. She could still see the scuff mark on the linoleum if she looked at exactly the right angle. Now she was training a new class of nurses, and her voice had changed. It wasn't aggressive or harsh. It was just authoritative. The kind of voice that came from having made life-and-death decisions and lived with the consequences. When you see someone in crisis, and I mean real crisis, the kind where their body is still fighting a war their mind thinks is still happening, you don't escalate, she told them. You approach with hands visible. You use steady eye contact. You speak in a calm, measured rhythm. You treat them like a person who's temporarily lost perspective, not like a threat. Sarah Chen was in the front row, taking notes. She'd moved to the night shift specifically to work under Megan's supervision. "The procedure we use here is called verbal de-escalation with embedded trauma recognition. It's not taught in standard nursing schools because it requires understanding military psychology at a level most civilian facilities don't prioritize. But San Diego is a military town. Your patients will include people who've seen combat. You need to recognize what you're looking at." Marcus Webb appeared in the doorway during her lunch break. He looked healthier. The tension that had lived in his shoulders was gone, replaced by something that looked like purpose. "Wanted to follow up," he said quietly. "I got that job. Veterans Crisis Counselor. Starting next month." "Good," Megan said. "The work matters. Because of what you did," he said. "You didn't just save my life that day. You showed me what it looked like to be calm under fire. That stays with you." He left a photograph on her desk before he went. It was Marcus, his sister, and their mother at a restaurant somewhere. All of them smiling. The kind of moment that only existed because someone had recognized what he needed and given it to him without judgment. Megan's office was small but significant. The desk faced the door, the way a commander's desk should. The walls held her certifications, her degrees from Johns Hopkins and Stanford, and, framed now, finally, after 6 years of hiding, the faded Navy unit patch. Beside it hung a photograph of her team in Ramadi. 5 people in desert fatigues, squinting at the camera with the specific exhaustion of people who'd just come back from somewhere dangerous. 3 of them were still alive. She looked at that photograph every morning before the shift started. Not out of nostalgia. Out of obligation. These were the people she'd trained with. The people who trusted her with their lives. The people whose names she couldn't say out loud until Agent Cross had restored her official status. Dr. Hargrove was teaching CPR certification courses at San Diego Community College now. Minimum wage. The kind of work that came with no authority, no institutional power, and no ability to ever practice medicine again. His license had been formally revoked 6 weeks after his termination. The investigations into financial fraud were still ongoing, but the FBI seemed confident about prosecution. Megan never thought about him anymore. That was the true victory. He'd occupied her mind for 3 months, his opinions, his power, his ability to shape her career. Now he occupied nothing. He was background noise. A teaching assistant at a community college who reminded her, every time she saw the news, that power built on fear is fragile. The final shift meeting of the week included a presentation on Megan's new web protocol, the formal training module for de-escalating veteran patients in crisis. The hospital was going to offer it hospital-wide. Linda Martinez, the charge nurse, had suggested the name. It made sense. Marcus Webb's crisis had become education. His struggle had become protection for other veterans who might come through those same doors. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns, Megan said at the end of the presentation. She wasn't looking at anyone specifically. She was looking at all of them. The nurses who'd watched her get fired. The ones who'd whispered about whether community college credentials meant anything. The ones who'd now seen her name on federal documentation and understood they'd been wrong about what they were looking at the whole time. If you see a warrior in crisis, you don't run. You recognize what you're looking at and you help. That's what we do here now. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss stories about the unsung heroes working in medicine and emergency services, the people whose biggest battles happen in hospitals, not on battlefields. Like and comment if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value.